My name is Amy Luschke. I am a Director of Member Services here at Minnesota DHIA and happy to be moderating the webinar here today with you all. Gerard Cramer is an Associate Professor in the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine at the University of Minnesota. He comes to us from Canada, where he spent the early part of his career. And I understand that, Gerard, you were a dairy farmer first, and then you've done a lot of other work, including getting your DVM degree there in Canada and working through some other positions. Maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Joining faculty at U of M in 2013 then, thereafter. So Gerard lives in the Twin Cities.
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction. I'll just share my screen and I can right there.
Wonderful.
Perfect. Everybody can see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Yeah, so as Amy mentioned, this is the longest I've held a job. It's been 11 years. So I have, because of a farm accident, and I ended up being a dairy farmer. It's was always my dream, but I milk 50 cows and I can fix cows, or specifically cows' feet, but I can't fix equipment, silo loaders and that kind of stuff. So I quickly realized that being a jack of all trades probably wasn't good for me. So eventually we sold the family dairy farm. And then I did my graduate work because I was a veterinarian kind of at the same time as I was being a farmer. And then I opened my own practice and I focused on feet in Canada. And then I injured my finger. And then I applied to University of Minnesota and they made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. And here I am. So that's kind of the background. I think some of you have heard some of me talk before. So I want to keep it relatively interactive. So if you're like, hey, we don't need to hear this, we already know this, let's move on to some other topic. We can do that. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. I'm okay with that. I'm pretty flexible. Amy asked me to talk a little bit about the genetics project I'm doing. I have that stuff at the end, so I'll make sure I'll leave some time. What time do you want me to wrap up, Amy?
Oh, I think we have a good 45 minutes here if you want that. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that's fine. I'm pretty flexible, so we can skip over some stuff to leave some time at the end. So make sure we have that if we need to. Oops, that'll have Zoom. Just so everybody knows, this is the people that have given me money. So kind of my conflict of interest statement. As you can see, there's lots of people on there. I think I have a Minnesota DHIA logo on there somewhere, just to illustrate the support that everybody's given me. If I mention a product or see pictures of like a shoot or something, it's not necessarily because they've given me money, because there's competing companies all over my slides. So just so you're aware of people that are supporting my research and have given me money for talks and stuff like that. What I want to get started with is kind of like the title of my topic was how to get more 0% lameness days. Because I would argue it's probably impossible to have 0% lameness, just like we're never going to have 0% mastitis, but you can have days that you don't have new cases or days that you don't have a lame cow. And I think to kind of get that started, I want you to think a little bit about locomotion scoring, especially with the new farm program and the standards that are coming out. So I'm going to look at a few cows, and if you want to either put it in the chat or just make your mic live and we can discuss the cow that we're seeing. So using the farm scoring system, what score would this cow be? A 1, 2, or a 3? What do you all think?
We have a vote for a 3 in the chat here from Jeff.
Yes, right. So hopefully that's pretty clear that this is a 3 cow. So those are the cows I would hope nobody struggles to identify on their farms. Let's look at another cow. So 1, 2, or 3.
Quiet group here today, Gerard.
I know, Jeff's gonna have to put it in the chat again or something. I'm okay if you put it in the chat. So, yeah. So the farm. Oh, go ahead.
Jeff says 1, and I think I would agree. Yeah.
Perfect. Nice. So that's the farm program would give this cow a 1. All right. So let's move on. We can probably guess what this cow is, but 1, 2, or 3.
Boy, she's got a lot of swelling on that front knee, doesn't she? And a little bit of hump to her back.
Yep, she has that. What do we all think? Val's put in a 2. Perfect. Yeah, we can guess right. Um, so Amy picked out some of the things, right? So the swelling, that's probably not necessarily why she's lame, because if she had a lot of front leg lameness, the things we look for is how much her head bobs, back arch sometimes, but that's the biggest thing. The biggest thing I'm looking for is if her back foot is landing where her front foot was. So if you watch where her front foot is, see if I hold the cursor where her front foot was, her back foot should land there, and it's not. So she's short striding, is that what we call it. And we can easily identify like both the 2s and the 3s. We can identify that the right hind in this cow is basically the problem. And as soon as you can identify a leg in the 3-point scoring system, that's what we identify as a lame cow. So there's kind of a illustration of the farm program and the scores they have. So the score 1 cow is basically normal cows. The score 2 cows are the mildly lame cows, and the 3s are the severely lame cows. And there's different signs that you can see. So back arch is one of them. Then I'll kind of go through to asymmetric gait or stride length. So that's kind of what I was talking about. It's saying, okay, how long are our strides? So you can see the 2s and the 3s. The ones we can see where she's landing, right? That's basically where her front foot was. And here, both of them are short striding. And then the weight shifting is the movement she's making as she's putting her foot down, right? So she's trying to say, okay, that hurts. I want to spend as little amount of time on there as I can. And the head bob is usually front leg lameness indicators. So those are kind of the 3 scoring systems, right? Oh, and it sounds like my dogs are going to bark, so we'll see what happens. What I want you to kind of make you aware of in the past, so in version 4, the criteria was that you had to have 95% of your cows either score 1 or 2. So 95% of your cows below 3. So that means you could have less than 5% of cows being a severely lame cow. So starting in June, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing because depending on how you interpret it and how you read it, the standards right now read that I just checked that this 85% has to be score 1. You can still have less than 5% with score 3. So that's one critical improvement point you make. And then the combination is less than 15. If you talk to the auditors, some of them say it's 15% here and 5% here. She could have less than 20. That's where it's a little bit confusing, but I want you to make you aware of the standards are changing. So if you have a lot of score 2 cows, which I argue those are the cows we can do something with, these 3 cows are typically too severe already. And we either need to call them or euthanize them, or they need more severe intervention. As opposed to the 2 cows, we can actually make an impact. So just to be aware that with the new standards coming in June, you are going to be expected to have less of these cows. And I would argue the average for 2s and 3s together in the US is between 20 and 30%. So that means a lot of dairies, if the scoring is done accurately, would have a continuous improvement plan related to lameness. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Right? Because I would argue if we truly score the way the system's set up to score, a lot of dairies would have a continuous improvement. Hopefully, as soon as the male person goes away, the dogs will stop again, if you can hear my dogs. So I want you to kind of think about bottlenecks, and then we'll talk a little bit about digital dermatitis, hoof-horn lesions, and if there's time, we'll talk a little bit about trimming. Kind of get at what are the important things to do. Okay, so if we think about bottlenecks, right, if our goal is to have less lame cows or to keep healthy cows, what we can think about is water flowing through a pipe. And on each dairy, there's different things that are causing cows to go lame. So I have a healthy cow here, and our goal is to have a healthy cow coming out over here. So there could be things related to trimming, hygienes, or foot bathing, for example. Right? And these are different impacts that they have. So trimming on this dairy has a little impact, whereas the foot bath has a big impact. Now, if I, as a consultant, comes in or your veterinarian comes in and says, oh, your trimmer needs to change the methods, and we're going to change this area, we're not going to have any less lame cows because the biggest bottleneck is here. So what I want you to think about, or what I want people to think about on their dairies is, okay, which is the biggest factor that's causing problems for me lameness-wise? Because I can fix my trimming and upgrade it, but if the problem is really, the biggest problem is related to my foot bath, I'm not going to have as big as an impact as I could. So I want you to think about, and we can put that in the chat, what's the biggest bottleneck on your neighbor's dairy? You don't have to out your own dairy, but what's the biggest bottleneck on your neighbor's dairy to having less lame cows?
Well, I can speak for a lot of neighbors that I see, Gerard, and I would venture a guess maybe, well, some combination of lack of laying and too much standing.
Okay, so lack of laying or too much standing, that's a typical answer, or some people say it's the foot bath, that type of thing. I'm actually going to argue that it's not, those are things that are true, they contribute to it, but the biggest bottleneck to having too many lame cows is actually not finding enough lame cows. And I'll try to kind of walk you through why. So if we do a better job finding lame cows, you're actually going to have less lame cows in the long term, which seems completely counterintuitive, but let me explain. Okay, so we're going to talk about an 8-cow herd. And we're going to say that by magically it's a seasonal calving herd, and every cow is started on day 0, calved at the same time, right? And the days in blue is how long, or the color blue indicates how long a cow's lame. And then the red line is when we're looking for lame cows. So let's assume you have your farm audit coming and it's 125 days of milk, and that's the day the farm auditor is coming. Okay, so the duration of lameness for cow 1 is here. So on the day of assessment, cow 1 would be lame, cow 3 would be lame, cow 6 would be lame, and cow 7 would be considered lame. So we have a 50% prevalence of lameness in this 8-cow dairy. So now let's say you heard this crazy person from the University of Minnesota talk, and he says you need to find more of your lame cows. And when you find them earlier, what's going to happen is they're lame for a shorter time period, right? If we find them and we treat them appropriately, we're going to take, for example, cow 7, and I'll kind of flip to the next one. We're going to take cow 7. So instead of normally finding her here, we're going to find her relatively quick, and we're going to reduce the amount of time that she's lame. So if we reduce the amount of time that she's lame, so for example, cow 1, on the day of assessment, the light gray here, she's no longer lame at this time period. She was still a lame cow in your herd, so your actual number of lame cows hasn't changed, but the time that she was lame has changed. So on this dairy, on the day of assessment, because we've changed one practice, this cow's no longer lame, so she doesn't count anymore. This cow's no longer lame, she doesn't count anymore. This cow's no longer lame, she doesn't count anymore. So there's only one lame cow in this dairy, even though we haven't fixed anything related to lying time or our foot bath. All we've changed is how long our cows are lame. And we can make this change pretty dramatically on most dairies without spending a lot of money. The money gets spent on finding lame cows, but it doesn't get spent on changing stalls, installing an expensive foot bath, putting more chemicals in, those type of things. What we've done is we've said, okay, we need to find more of our lame cows earlier, right? Because all these cows are lame and they're still going to exist. We just have to make sure we find them at the right time. So I would argue the biggest bottleneck in the industry is we're not finding lame cows on dairies. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we find lame cows? So there needs to be a system to find lame cows. Kind of like in our repro programs way back when I graduated, we were still talking, or when I was young, my dad was like, okay, when we're sitting outside, you're having a coffee or tea, make sure you watch for cows in heat, right? We all know how that goes. We see cow in heat and it's like, oh, somebody else will say it. There has to be a system to systematically make it happen, right? Either we use heat detection, we use chalking. So there's a system. So every cow gets chalked on a different day. We use sync programs, those type of things. We have to think about finding lame cows in the same way. So we have to do it systematically. The severe cows, so the 3 cows need to be seen immediately. And then the mild cows, because the scoring isn't system. So I would say if there's 2 cows that you see and one's mild and she was mild last week, then I would look at her. But some cows just walk funny for a day and then they're fine again. So it needs to be some sort of thing. But the key point is we need to look on a systematic basis. So depending on the size of the dairy, some people score a pen each day. Other people do the whole herd on every Monday, and then they treat the next cows the next day, for example. But the key is we need to find them and we need to treat them. So we can't wait for the hoof trimmer to come, because if the hoof trimmer comes every 6 months and you have a lame cow 3 months later, we can't wait 3 months for her to be seen, because then that's how we end up with those number 3 cows. All right. So we kind of said, okay, that's one thing we can do. So, but that really doesn't solve what Amy was trying to get at. How do we create less lame cows, right? So one thing is finding the lame cows, but how do we create less of them? The other thing so I was jumping ahead a little bit. One of the bottlenecks that is is also a bottleneck is we have all this trimming data. So if your roof trimmer writes something down either on paper or uses a fancy tablet, these are just different versions of a tablet. How do we link that information up with whatever herd management software you're using, right? Because then we can make informed decisions. Typical questions I typically get is, how do we do X, right? Can I foot bath less? Do I have to foot bath in the winter? How many times should I trim my herd? If we have data that's integrated with your herd management software, we can do that, right? So this is an example. This is a 600 cow dairy. I've graphed every single case of digital dermatitis on this dairy by lactation, right? So I think if I add them up, there's about 20 in the past year. There's about 20-ish cases of digital dermatitis in it, including some of the cows that are repeat. So when we look at this data, I could say, we probably could foot bath a little less. We can save some money on foot bathing, depending on how risk averse that is. Or another example is, should I change my foot bath program in the winter? And if we graph the number of digital dermatitis cases or foot regions by month, basically, we can say, is there a pattern, yes or no, and do we need to change it? Same if we know when the lesions are happening, right? So if I know when my lesions are happening, so this is just a graph that days in milk on the bottom, and when the lesions are being diagnosed by the trimmer or found by the trimmer, right? And then we can say, does it work to do a mid-lactation trim? Should I do a mid-lactation trim? We don't have to get into the specifics of this graph, but if we have that information, we can say, why are all the lesions being found right here? And in this dairy, it's because we're doing a mid-lactation trim. It's actually telling us that we're not finding cases early enough because the trimmer is the lame cow detector. The farm isn't necessarily doing it. Yeah, let's get into some specifics of some of the lesions. Let's talk about digital dermatitis or hairy wart, right? So this is the common lesion that we look at. What we're looking at is basically the raw, painful, active lesion. To address it, there's a couple things we need to think about. We need to focus on heifers. We need to treat them appropriately when we find them. And when we talk about treating appropriately, there's a whole range of products on the market. So all these products, some of these products aren't available in the US, some of them are different ways. But what we need to think about is, what is the goal of our treatment, right? Why do we treat them? What is the best treatment that we need to think about? The goal for treatment is to reduce the pain as soon as possible, right? And then we also need to think about the expectation. So digital dermatitis, the red painful lesion that I showed you, is called an M2 lesion. So it's an active painful lesion, but there's different stages of this lesion. So you might see cows that have a little scab on it or have lots of skin and kind of hair sticking out. Those are either M3s or M4s. Those are more chronic stages. And applying a treatment, let's say we're going to use tetracycline as a treatment, that's not going to help these lesions. It's not going to change how that lesion functions. That's the role of the foot bath. So if we think about our treatment, we focus our treatment activities on these active lesions. And then our foot baths focus on all the other lesions. If you have cows coming back, let's say you have a lot of cows with M2s, the trimmer comes, he treats them, or they treat them with whatever product they're using. The goal for those would be that they're no longer painful within a week, basically, as fast as possible. So in my hands, that's tetracycline. Other dairies use other products or hoof trimmers because of milk withdrawal and everything else. We use other products, but the goal should still be that these cows are not painful as fast as possible. Then the foot bath program you use keeps these lesions in check. So once they're treated, they end up as an M3 or an M4. And then the foot bath, whatever we put in it, is going to keep it in check and prevent them from going back to M2s. If your lesions are coming back, 99.9% of the time, it's not because of the treatment you're using, unless it's really aggressive. It's because your foot bath program isn't appropriate enough. Okay. So then, right, so we're going to focus on heifers, because if we have digital dermatitis, should be considered a lifelong infection. The goal isn't necessarily to cure it. The goal is to make the cow not painful. So if we get it in heifers, she's going to have it for the rest of her life. We're going to treat them appropriately, and then we're going to foot bath enough. Right? And foot bathing enough basically means we use the right foot bath. And if you think you have too much digital dermatitis, the solution is typically to make sure you have the right foot bath length, but then turn that dial of foot bathing, right? So if you think you have too much of it, I would argue we need to increase the frequency of foot bathing, right? And a good foot bath has the right length. So ideally, this is some examples of different foot baths. So this is a 10 to 12 foot foot bath. It's narrow, so that the solution stays in. And if we make it narrow and long, we kind of maintain the 50-gallon that we're used to in the shorter foot baths. So the cost stays relatively the same. Okay, and then the question I always get is, how often should we do it? And this is where, when we talked about data, the answer truly is it depends. It depends, are you happy with it? And then as much as necessary. So I would truly argue that you, as a dairy, pick how much digital dermatitis you have. Right. And then once you have that data, you can say, okay, is it working? If I have too much and I change my frequency, I can say, are we getting less or more of it based on what we're doing? And this is that example that I talked about. So I would argue in this third, we can decide if we're willing to take that risk and say, okay, we have a low incidence. What can we do? We can probably save some money on copper sulfate costs and change the frequency. Okay. Move on to a little bit of hoof-horn lesions. Questions about digital dermatitis before I move on?
I'll ask a question here, Gerard, more related to foot baths. Every now and then I see a foot bath setup where they have a pre-bath and then a solution bath. What do you think about that approach?
So yeah, that's used to be common. It's becoming less common. So the theory behind them was in the past that what we're trying to do is trying to clean the foot before we expose it to the chemical. Historically, when those barns are built, we have a 6-foot foot bath where we put water in, we have a little bit of separation, and then we have another 6-foot foot bath after. When we started looking at those foot baths, what actually happens is the cow walks through the first foot bath, and then by the time they enter the second foot bath, they're making manure and putting all the manure in the second foot bath. So they're actually contaminating your treatment foot bath more frequently. So in dairies that have the 2-foot bath, typically in those dairies, both foot baths are too short. So my advice to those dairies is to put chemicals in both, because now you have 2 6-foot foot bath, and then you end up with a 12-foot foot bath. You actually get more value with it. And the theory that it cleans the foot is probably not necessarily true, because it makes 1-foot bath dirtier. The other thing that it does is now you have a wet foot, and then you're putting a wet. Let's imagine you had a wet teat, and then you got to put teat dip on a wet teat, So it's kind of the same theory. Like we have a foot that's now been soaked in water for a couple seconds, and you're going to put it back in water with a different chemical solution. So you're probably diluting that chemical out even more. I'm not a big fan of using the wash bath.
Thank you.
All right, so when I talk about hoof-horn lesions, what I'm talking about is lesions that are kind of on the slide. So this lesion we call hemorrhage or bruising, which is basically an early sole ulcer. An ulcer is this lesion right here, typically in this location or always in this location. And then this lesion here is a white line lesion. So you can see the white line is kind of the separation of the wall and the horn. Where they come together is called the white line. And this one has, this picture here is on purpose, it has a little bit of pus on it. If your hoof dermer is writing down abscess, what we need to find out is it an ulcer or is it a white line? Because this is an abscess, but in practice, what we find is a lot of hoof dermers write this lesion down as an abscess too, if there's any liquid that comes out of it. So the reason we like to separate them is that the things that cause these two lesions is different. So if we know if it's a white line versus a sole ulcer, we can get at what is causing it, and we'll kind of talk through what it is. I would argue for these hoof-horn lesions, we know how to treat them. We know what we need to do to fix them or to make them better, make the cow walk better. We know how to prevent them. And what we truly need to understand is these are the source of the chronic cows. So on the data we've collected through herds here in Minnesota, the industry actually doesn't make a lot of new lame cows, but we accumulate a lot of them. So if I start looking at, okay, I just want to do a study and I want to test an intervention saying, does hoof trimming work on cows? If I take out all the lame cows or all the cows with lesions, I only get about 1 to 2% of most lesions that I find. Right, so let's, for example, I'm treating 100 cows. I want to trim 100 cows and I want to see, does this trimming technique work? If I take 100 clean cows, in the next lactation, I might probably at max get 3 to 4% of cows with ulcers. But if I go score that herd overall, let's say in the whole herd, there's 300 cows, my lameness prevalence is going to be 20 to 30%. But we're not making new ones. The reason we have so many lame cows is because we have so many chronic cows. And the reason we do that is because we don't treat these lesions appropriately and we don't find them early enough. And why does it happen? So what's the goal of treatment? How do we prevent that from happening or prevent the chronicity from happening? So the goal of treatment is to find lesions really early. So this is a sole bruising or sole hemorrhage. I prefer the sole hemorrhage because bruising, people think, okay, she stepped on a stone, and it's actually what's happening inside the foot, which I'll kind of show a little bit about. But this is a very, very early lesion that was painful. So we put a block on it. And within 4 weeks, the goal should be that there's nothing left here, right? There's a little bit of bruising left, but this cow is no longer painful. If we wait till this horn is completely damaged or the corium is no longer able to grow horn, then we've had more inflammation and more chance for chronicity to happen, right? So we're going to use a block on them. Every single cow that has a white line, a sole ulcer, or a toe problem needs a block, in my opinion, right? And then the block size matters. So I'm a big fan of bigger blocks because we're trying to take the weight off. Right. So historically, we use much smaller blocks because we looked at the foot and said, oh, this is the size of the foot. We need to make sure we cover it. But that forgets about how a cow walks. When a cow walks, her heel hits first, and then she pushes off. So we need a block that makes sure that when the cow's walking, this foot doesn't take any weight. We're trying to take the pressure off that hoof, trying to reduce the tension for that wound. So we need to use bigger blocks. And there's some guidelines related to blocks. So I want a thick block and I want a relatively long block. So the 5 1/4, that's probably the size minimum size I would use on jerseys. And for larger Holsteins, we're probably up to 6 inches. Okay, and there's some different examples, depending on the farm or how much wear you have on a dairy. So people always ask me, do I use a plastic or a wooden block? Wood works fine if you're in a low wear environment, but if you're using sand or recycled sand, then you probably have to shift towards using more plastic blocks or rubber blocks that are firm and don't wear as much, right? The key is some of these blocks have a give, so that you might think, okay, that's more comfortable. But when the block gives or shifts or turns, when the cow takes her step, now we're putting pressure back on the other side. So I actually prefer a block that's hard like wood. And then if we need to have plastic blocks, then I like a block that's firm. So there's some examples that are pretty giving. So there's some, you'll probably have seen some rubber blocks that you can bend with your fingers. I'm not a big fan of those because I want the stability and the hardness from it. And we want them to last 4 weeks, which means that for our treatments, we're going to put the block on. We're going to remove the loose horn. This is just an example of what that looks like. So we've removed all the loose horn, and the goal is to minimize the amount of bleeding, right? And that takes a skilled person and also takes sharp tools. And the question we have is, should I put a bandage on it, right? So we have this big open wound, and the inclination is to put something on this to stop the bleeding. But I would argue if we do that, so this is some picture taken by somebody in Iowa, and this is an example. This is lesion 24 hours before had tetracycline put on. So tetracycline, what we're trying to do is kill the bugs. But this lesion, sole ulcers, are not caused by anything infections. They're caused by pressure. And I'll kind of show you how that happens, but nothing infectious. And if you put an infectious or a caustic agent, such as tetracycline or copper sulfate or anything on that lesion, now it damages that tissue, right? So this is 24 hours after putting a tet wrap on. And then 3 weeks later, what can happen is you kind of get this proud flesh or tissue proliferation. When we damage that tissue by putting anything on it, what happens is the body response is, ow, that hurts. I have to repair myself first before I can grow horn. So the role of that tissue that I saw here, its sole job in life is to grow horn. And if we damage that tissue, the first thing it has to do is fix itself. And then it can grow horn. And that delays the time that exists or treatment or that it takes. So then we talked a little bit about rechecks. What that means, and I would argue any cow that has a block put on, we need to look at again in 4 to 6 weeks. Just like you, when you go to the doctor, if you have a cast put on, we either take the cast off, we do x-rays, we do something to say, is this healing as we expected? The way I look at it is you can not do this, but the cow's then going to choose to come back at you at some point in time anyway. So I'd rather choose the time I'm going to see this cow instead of waiting 90, 120, 160 days before she's lame again. So I want to make sure we can take the block off if needed or address any concerns if the block's still on or the lesion's not healing. And so this is just an example. So this is the same lesion I was showing before. So this is a cow I saw kind of in between my regular routine trims on this dairy. So we treated this lesion, found this lesion. Basically, 3 weeks later, this is what we're left with, right? We still have a lesion, but because we're doing a rechecks, we can clean this up a little bit, right? So this lesion here, if we kept this horn that's sitting over top of that, if we kept that there, it traps bacteria and it delays the healing. So if we clean that up again, we can put we can get faster healing happening again. So we kind of speed up the healing process. So this was 3 weeks. That's probably a little fast. Would have been okay for 4 weeks. But kind of in that time frame is beneficial to recheck. So in this scenario, because the lesion's still open, we keep the blocks on. If this foot is healed and no longer painful, we would have taken the block off. Okay. So I said we know what causes it, or we have an understanding of what causes it. The theory is basically there's a whole bunch of steps that go together. So Amy brought up standing time. So what happens is basically we have cows that are standing too much or calving or bearing inappropriate weight up in here. And because the way the foot is stuck together, this bone we call P3 puts too much pressure on the corium, right? So the corium is this tissue right here. And this is just a very early lesion that we're seeing. That's the start of a sole ulcer. But this causes inflammation. So when I put too much pressure or the cow's standing too much, it causes inflammation. That inflammatory process on the corium also impacts the bone. So what happens is we have inflammation in this tissue, and you can see this tissue is very thin. So when that tissue is very thin, there's inflammation happening there. It acts on that tissue, but also on the tissue above it. The tissue above it is the bone. So what happens if we have inflammation, and this is a bone that has kind of, we call them bone spurs or bony growth stuck to it, right? Those bone spurs put more pressure on the corium. We end up with this vicious cycle, and eventually you end up with lame cows. Now, if we have a chronic cow or a cow that has a history of lameness, this is just an example of what happens. So this is a cow where we've taken a CT, like basically a fancy X-ray of the cow's foot for a healthy cow or a cow without a lameness history and a cow with a lameness history. And what we're looking at is this bone here called P3, and it's relatively smooth. This is same healthy cow. This is a cow with a lameness history, and you can see all those bony protrusions sticking out. So what those bony protrusions mean, that every step that cow takes, she's walking on the corium, and it's like you walking with a stone in your boot 24/7. And so that's why some of these cows, as we treat them, they get worse, or they don't get better, right? They stay kind of at that score 2 cows. And these are the chronic cows that I'm talking about. So the whole goal is when this cow gets an ulcer, we want to minimize the amount of inflammation she has. And the longer she has that inflammation, basically the longer she's lame, the more inflammation and the more bony changes we get. Right, so how do we fix this, right? The control, we have to focus, like Amy said, standing time, right? So if we think about how this bone is sitting, it's basically hanging kind of in a sling-like and putting pressure on the corium. So anything that makes cows stand more puts undue pressure, for example, by trimming or things like corkscrews, or around calving time, those tendons and ligaments relax and put more pressure on it. So those 3 factors, if we focus our energies on those 3 factors and think about preventing transition cow problems, making sure cows don't stand, we address what we can do with ulcers and white lines, right? So we're going to focus on minimizing standing time, do a good job trimming, and then focus on stress-free calving. Basically, think of lameness as a transition cow disease. If you don't have transition cow problems, you're likely going to have less lameness too, focusing on the hoof farm lesions. So the difference between ulcers and white lines, so white lines are typically caused by things like flooring. So if you have a lot of white line things, what we're thinking about is we have some of those things, standing time and trimming and stress-free calving, but the factor, instead of just focusing on standing time, is how slippery your floors are or how aggressive your cow movement is. If the cows are slipping more, we're going to see more white lines. So that's why it's important to differentiate those 2. All right, how much time do I have left?
You're sitting good, don't worry.
Okay, perfect. So let's talk a little bit about trimming, right? So we think about trimming, typically, historically, the recommendation is every cow needs to be trimmed twice a year. That's very easy for somebody like me to say because it's a relatively fail-safe recommendation. And historically, we thought about that, saying, okay, we trim if we got twice a year. That means the trimmer comes twice a year, does the whole herd. But I want you to kind of think about what are we really trying to do with our cows, right? So I think on dairies, there's basically 4 groups of cows that need trimming, right? So there's the healthy cows. So these are the cows that have never had a lesion, and we trim them to kind of prevent lameness, okay? And I would argue how frequently we trim those cows totally depends on how much wear we have. So if we're in a recycled sand-bedded herd with not even that much walking distance, we might not necessarily need to trim these cows. Because, for example, this foot here is the right length, and all we did to this cow was did a little bit of modeling. And we could argue, is that really even necessary? I think there's benefits to it, but do we need to do it twice a year? When we've looked at it, the impact of that is minimal. So I would argue these cows, if we have high wear environments, probably only need to be trimmed once a year. But if it's a low wear environment, we get that excess of horn growth, then they need to be trimmed more frequently. So those cows, if you have, let's say, a mattress facility, they could be trimmed less or more frequently. They need to be trimmed more frequently. Okay, and that's just look at your data, saying, okay, how often when are we getting lesions? When should that happen? How do we prevent them? So at minimum, I think every cow needs a dry off trim, but then to me, it becomes very herd specific or even cow specific. And depending, and with softwares that exist, we can make that happen. Then the next group of cows are cows that are lame, right? So cows that are lame, they need to be trimmed immediately, right? So those cows, we cannot wait till the trimmer comes based on we're trying to prevent that chronicity. So what we're trying to do is we need to address those cows right away. Okay, so treat them immediately and appropriately. We kind of discussed that already. Then the next group of cows is your cows that need a recheck, right? So this cow here moves into this category, right? She was here, she became lame, now she's in this category. Okay, those cows, we set up a system, they get seen, let's say every 4 to 6 weeks until they're no longer lame or till the block's healed, and then we move into a different category. So then depending on the category or on our criteria, the next group of cows is your chronic cows, cows that have shown us that I'm going to be a lame cow. I am going to come back to you next lactation. So those cows I actually trim more frequently, right? So this cow here, I might trim once a year. These cows are in their own cycle. But for some dairies, cows in the chronic category, they might get trimmed 3 times a year, right? Because that's what's best for that cow, because then she doesn't go lame, right? Then we didn't know with severe lesions. So I want you to think about how do we make our intervention strategic instead of just doing a blanket treatment. Just like with moving towards strategic dry off, I want you to think about strategic trimming. Okay, so these are the chronic cows. Remember the inflammation. Every 3 to 4 months typically is when those cows should be done. Okay, so we kind of bring things back. If we think about our bottlenecks, the biggest one I think on most areas is finding lame cows, but then it comes identifying what it is that's causing the problem. Unfortunately, in most areas, it is the foot bath that's most problem, and then we're probably talking hygiene and trimming if I were to rank them. Okay, so that's kind of summarizing. I hope I've given you an idea. Let's talk a little bit about the project that Amy originally wanted me to talk about. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a combination of things. So the Council of Dairy Cattle Breeding is working with me to try and create a genetic evaluation. So their interest is to create a genetic evaluation for both mobility and lameness. I have an interest in using that data to answer some questions I have related to, okay, what's truly the impact of lameness on productivity and culling? Because there's a lot of data out there, but they don't separate chronic versus new lesions. And I also think we can answer some questions with all that data related to how frequently should we trim them? When should we trim cows? That type of thing. With a large amount of data, we can do that. Okay. So the other thing we're trying to do, and you're welcome to participate. So if you want to, there's a survey we're trying to do. So how are you using technology related to lameness? So if you scan this QR code, I'll have it show up at the end again. There's a survey here that if you're willing to participate in, you can, and it gives us some information trying to figure out, okay, how are people wanting to use lameness or the technology for lameness, and how are people using it right now? There is a nice incentive for you to participate. You get a nice little University of Minnesota beanie for participating, or there's a chance to get a few Minnesota beanies. Okay, I would argue what we need is to change our approach a little bit. Time to take action. Right? So the title of this project is kind of a long title, but basically what we're trying to do is trying to transform dairy cattle lameness through a combination of artificial intelligence, so video cameras, genomic, epidemiological, and extension approaches. So our approach is to take a whole bunch of data that exists that's currently on dairies already. So right now, dairies our hoof trimmers are recording data. The dairies have data about cows, and we're trying to combine all that data. There's a technology out there that gives cows visual locomotion scores. We're trying to compare all that data, have it go through CDCB database, and then come up with genetic evaluations, and also include the epidemiological stuff that I was discussing before. Okay, so what are we trying to do? Like, we have this framework where all the data would kind of come together. And then the biggest objective is to create a genetic evaluation. Okay. Then I would argue in the future, and this has already happened in other countries, some of these technologies are going to be used to address animal welfare standards, right? So right now, the farm assessor comes in and says, this is your lameness prevalence. In the future, there's opportunity to make that less subjective and more objective by some of that data that exists that could be potentially be collected. So that's one evaluation. So I say, how does it correlate with typical collection metric? Then the next thing is, because can we use the camera technology? And I'll show you what the camera technology is to find lame cows earlier. What does that cost? Is a return to doing that? Okay, and then what we want to do, this is where the survey comes in. Then we want to put people together and kind of create working groups to say, okay, we know most the dairy industry struggles a little bit with lameness. What do we need to do? I think one solution is to work together. So we're going to create these working groups and say, what resources do you need, right? Do you need more information about foot bath? Do you need more information on X, Y, Z? But we're going to create the supportive structure to make that happen, and then create some online courses and resources and bilingual courses that people can take to get those resources. So it's kind of combining all the aspects, right? We're trying to take the genetic aspect, create long-lasting change, take the people and dynamics there, say, work with them. What do we need to equip them to do a better job? Can we use technology, potentially find lame cows? So what does that look like? I've talked a little bit about this camera technology. So what this camera technology is trying to do is identifying this cow and trying to give her a locomotion score basically on how she walks. So there's different points that this technology identifies, and it says this cow is a score. They give it a score out of 100. So they might give her a 70, for example. But it has technology that based on, they can identify the cow here, and then it tracks back using kind of facial recognition type technology to say, what is the score of this cow? Okay. So we're starting a pilot project. So CDCB has been working with me for a couple of years to try to get, is this even feasible? Can we make this happen? And then with a long-term goal to get funding from typically the USDA or the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research to get some funding to kind of take the first step to create this innovation. So what are we at right now? So currently we have this technology that we're getting the data for in 4 farms. We have another 2 to 4 potentials going on with it. This technology has been on the market already. So we're trying to work with these farms that are willing to share the data. Okay. So the data to share with you so far. So what we're trying to say, this is the score that the camera gives the cow. And then we have trimming happens here. And then we have scores going back 4 weeks before trimming. So the question we're trying to answer is, how does the score relate to if the cow has a lesion or not? So the scores in blue are showing you what the score was if the cow had no problem. And then the scores in green are showing you what the scores were if the cow had a problem. So as you can see, the scores with problems, so the green bars, missing my cursor here, right? They're all a little bit higher. But what this is showing is the variation. But so the variation actually overlap, which is a problem if we're trying to use that technology for finding lame cows. But it does seem to identify cows or differentiate between cows without a lesion and cows with a lesion. So if we break that down a little bit more, let's look at specific lesions. So this is cows just looking at in the blue with digital dermatitis at trimming right here. Oops, if we look at the next one, this is cows with sole ulcers, and this is cows with white line disease. So our conclusion from this is so far is yes, it differentiates between different lesions. Cows with ulcers and white line have higher scores. But if we go back to the previous slide, there's some overlap in scores at certain time points with cows at trimming. And then for initial estimates for genetic analysis, if we look at just lesions, so what's the heritability of just looking at lesions? We'll at 2%, which is kind of what everybody else in the world has found. If we're looking at just the locomotion scores, we kind of bump it up to about 5%. And if we look at the variation in locomotion scores or the cow's average locomotion scores, we actually get a bit higher estimate. So there's promise in this technology. It needs to be fine-tuned, and we're still looking for more funding to make that happen. But basically, there's an opportunity to create a hoof health index, which is the ultimate goal for CDCB. And what we're trying to do is combine with cattle eye lesions, or I would argue it's not necessarily just cattle eye, it's automated detection methods and producer-recorded lameness. That's a long-term goal. And we're likely in the future, not all farms need to have all 3, right? We can take data from cows, trimmers that record lesions, or producer-recorded lameness, and that should all be able to feed into this index. Okay. And just to wrap this up, if you're interested in doing the survey, I'll leave this up while we take questions.
Well, super. Thank you, Gerard. That was an excellent rundown of a variety of different lesions and ways to think about them, and especially the anatomy of the hoof. All that comes into play real nicely. Any questions here for Gerard?
I do. This is Dave. You're not a big fan of wraps. Didn't see any wraps. Don't use them at all.
I hate wraps.
So you never use them on anything?
I use them on my grinders to keep them clean.
Okay.
So the reason for that is, so I'll give you a bit more background. So if we think about, let's turn it around a little bit, right? So if we have a cut on our finger and we have to go, let's say a bandage put on, what does the doctor tell us? Let's say we go to a doctor, it's severe enough that you need to go to a doctor. What is the first thing they tell you? Keep it clean and dry, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason we shower with rectal sleeves, because we don't want to get it wet. So if you imagine a wrap, the wrap is the equivalent of the bandage, right? So the wrap, two things I don't like about it. So one is it traps manure and dirt, right? So now we have an open wound, and the theory is if we wrap it, it's going to stay clean. What actually happens, we put her back in our barns, and unless our barns are completely pristine, so unless it's maybe a tie stall scenario, where that bandage is going to soak with manure within an hour. So now we have a wet environment that's touching that lesion. And then the other thing that the bandage does, it creates an anaerobic environment. So most of the problems, most of the bugs that cause problems on cows' feet are anaerobes. They don't like oxygen. So if you put a wrap on it, now you have no oxygen. So you have a perfect environment. We have a wet, moist environment that grows bacteria. The other thing that happens with wraps is if you use a wrap, typically people want to put something on the tissue before they put the wrap on. So they put iodine, copper, tetracycline, whatever. All those tissues, all those chemicals are caustic to the tissue. Even for digital dermatitis, I apply my treatment, I paste it on with a paintbrush, and I let the cow go. Because the last thing is, most people don't like taking wraps off, so they miss a few cows. And when you miss a few cows, that becomes another problem to deal with.
I have one more question if nobody else has one.
Sure.
You know, the scoring is you got a 1 to 3, but there was a lot of 1 to 5s. Everybody to do this has to get on the same page. Otherwise, you don't have good research stuff to go with, I think. That's not just with hoof trimming, it's with a lot of things that we do. Who comes up with the right scoring?
Exactly. So yes. So the 1 to 5 system was popularized by a mineral company. And the 1 to 3 system is like used by the farm program, but there's even a 4-point system, there's a 10-point system. The reason they have all these systems is because none of them are perfect, right? And then even within the system, let's say, Dave, you score a cow, you score 100 cows, and I score 100 cows, and then tomorrow we score them again. We're going to differ between each other, and then we're going to difference among each, like between ourselves, right? So the scores that you give the cow yesterday are not going to be the same scores you're going to give ourselves tomorrow. That's part of the reason CDCB is interested in this technology, because that makes it consistent. In theory, it's not there yet, but in theory, technology should be more consistent. And that removes some of that subjectivity with it. Because I cannot train my research staff to score the edge cases consistently, right? So if a cow's like borderline between a 1 and a 2, one day they're going to give her a 1, next day they're going to give her a 2. And that's true across the industry. You're completely right. We need to standardize the scoring system. As an industry, we need to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And I would argue for you on farm, what's important is identifying the cow that you can treat and make a difference with, which are the 2s, right? So I would have a 1 are the cows that we can't make a difference. So cows that walk fine, it might be a little bit off, but if I put her in the chute, nothing happens, or I don't change her outcome. The other cows are 2s. And if she's a 3, that's just a flag to say she needs immediate attention. But as soon as you start going wider than 2 or 3, yes, you can identify, let's say you use the 5-point system. The 5-point system struggles between the 2s and the 3s, which is the same as struggling between the 1s and the 2s. Right, so we don't necessarily address the problem. So you're 100% right. We need to get a consistent scoring system. And that's why we're hoping to use technology to kind of get around that issue.
I have a question, Gerard, related to what you just talked about a slide or two ago about then recording data for this national system. You're aware that we have many different softwares out there, and every farmer likes to devise their own way to notate all these things. Is that something you're going to sift out with your team after the fact, or what should our farmers be thinking about for minimum requirements and best practices for recording the lameness events?
So great question and completely true. So right now, when we've looked at like the data that's coming in like through the traditional channels, it's not quite garbage, but it's pretty close to garbage. Because there's so much different variation. So what we've done in the pilot project, we've actually set up systems to record data consistently, right? So everybody writes down also, or there's a consistent way that's marked in the records. Right now we focused on farms that are using dairy count, but we can do the same in PC Dart or DHI Plus. It doesn't really matter. We can standardize the system coming in. We just need it to be standardized. And yes, farms can customize it, but if we set it up that we can identify, okay, if you customize it, don't touch these couple things because that is going to flag what it is, right? So the approach we're actually taking right now is to actually integrate with the farm management system, set up the system the way we think it should be set up, and then send it separate. So the data doesn't necessarily go to dairy records processing systems. It goes directly to CDCB. Take some of that out of the loop.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, there's standardization involved. That is key because it needs to be, because if we just look at lame, it's like, because everybody basically records lame in some way, shape, or form, but some people put it in, let's say, a foot trim or a trim event, whether that be in Bovisync or whatever. We need to be able to pull that out, but we also need to be able to pull out what's the cause, because the genetic evaluation for digital dermatitis is probably different than the genetic evaluation for soil ulcers. So the heritabilities are going to be different. We know they're different, so we need to separate those.
Okay, very good. Thank you again, Gerard. This was a very great talk, and happy to have you here again today.
No problem. Have a good day.
Thank you.